of fatal accidents, according to AAA, 56% of fatal accidents have to do with aggressive driving. 56%. That involves people who are, and aggressive driving was defined as that people are honking and tailgating and yelling and gesturing, is sort of what they said. And then it says that according to a study this year, 80% of people admit to somehow drive aggressively. 80% of people who drive say that they drive aggressively in some way. It actually said that most aggressive drivers are men from the ages of 19 to 39. What's that? 19 to 39 are the most aggressive drivers, and it says it's the worst is in the Northeast. Actually, the most aggressive driving happens in the Northeast. That's not me. That's AAA. If you have a problem with that, you have to talk to them. I'm just reporting the news. It's not me. If you think about this, the stats, it's pretty terrifying, and it's incredible that they were able to put this much information into a very short segment, but a pretty terrifying segment because the numbers are very, very high. If you just take that concept with me and transition from the source, the AAA source and NBC Nightly News, and move into a comedian called Louis C.K., I also want to continue the same topic. And if you ever watch anything by Louis C.K., you will know I'm going to filter and clean much of the dialogue I'm going to have with you now, since we are at synagogue. But if you watch him not from the synagogue, there are some other colorful pieces of language he likes to share that I'm not going to share with you, so you can, in your mind perhaps, add the particular pieces of colorful language that he might add if you were listening or watching him. So he does this interesting bit that I remembered actually after watching this section on NBC Nightly News last night about aggressive driving, and he talks about how people are typically okay and decent in most contexts, he says. But there's a specific environment that he thinks is when people become extremely dangerous, and he said behind the wheel. He does a very interesting segment about people behind the wheel, and he says that people, it's a great line from him, that says people for some reason have different values when they're driving. You have one set of values in every other context of your life, but when you're behind the wheel, you have a whole new set of values and a whole new outlook on the people around you in other vehicles. Sort of like all of your values literally go out the window, and you suddenly look at the things in the vehicle next to you, not as humans, and something engulfs us. And so he says something when you bind us into the metal and the glass, we sort of change into different people. And he gives an example. This is the clean version of it. And he says that he was driving and a person, and he uses this good analogy, just sort of what's the word? Drifted. Near his, not into his lane, but near his lane, and his immediate reaction was to think of the various ways that his family might be dead, is what he says. It just wandered over near him, he says. It wasn't even into his lane, just wandered by him, and he thought to himself, I wish everyone that they knew was dead. And he thinks to himself, that is not normal behavior. Our values go out the window when we're in a vehicle. We just get very aggressive and we get very angry. And he said, let's think of a different context. And he said, think of an elevator, a crowded elevator. If the person next to you in the elevator by mistake brushes up against you for a second, you do not have the same reaction as you do to the guy drifting over to your lane for a second. You might say, oh, that's no problem. Oh, can I press that floor for you? Oh, sure, that's perfectly fine. You don't want their entire family dead in the elevator. He said, could you imagine if they brushed against you and you turned, and he did this in the show, he turns in with the person and says, what are you doing? That doesn't happen in the elevator. It just happens in your mind when we're driving on the road. And so it talks about he sort of talks about anger. And so both of these pieces, the one from AAA and the one from Louis C.K., talks about anger, and the interesting idea behind it is, how do we manage it? How do we manage our anger, essentially? And so I think the context falls nicely into this week's Torah portion. The Torah portion is called Chukat. Chuk is it's a law. There are two kinds of laws in Judaism. There's a mishpat, which is a law that we can determine and play with, and there's a chuk, which you can't. It's sort of God saying, I'm giving you this rule, and you're going to do it. It's sort of like your parents saying, I told you so, don't ask me why. This is why. So, there's an interesting section about the red heifer, which is a whole different conversation, which we can talk about in Torah study tomorrow. But this one context this one section is about Moses. So Moses is coming off of a rebellion from last week, from one of his brethren who is another Levite, actually starts a rebellion against him. The guy's name is Korach. And so we start this week with the Israelites whining about not having any water. And so this is not the first time they're whining. It's also not the first time they're whining about not having any water. So they're really whining. Moses is probably not in the best possible place. He's probably a little agitated. And so God says this is directly from the Torah. The community was without water, and they joined against Moses and Aaron, against them. The people quarreled with Moses, saying, if only we had perished when our brothers perished at the sight of the Lord. And they go on to say, if only we had died in Egypt. And so Moses and Aaron sort of walk away and talk to God. And God says, I'll give you water, essentially. Take your brother, go stand by this rock, assemble the people, talk to the rock, and water will come out. But Moses, instead of talking to the rock, takes his staff, smacks the rock, and smacks it again. 2 times he smacks the rock. God says, walk over to the rock, talk to the rock, water will come out. He takes the staff, smacks it, and smacks it again. And he actually says, which we can talk more in Torah study tomorrow, he pretty much says, you people want water? I'll give you water. Smack, smack, and then the water comes out. And so some people will say, that is the moment God decides he can't enter the promised land. That moment. After all the things that he's done and all the trials and tribulations he's lived through, that moment, some people will say, that was it. God decides he's not going to the promised land. The one thing he's waiting for, he can't do. And some people say because of his rage, because he had, some people would say, a very short fuse. Now, I did my thesis on Moses, so I'm a Moses lover. I love him and I will protect him as much as humanly possible. But I don't know. No one's really sure about why he hits the rock twice, especially when God says, talk to the rock. Don't hit the rock, talk to the rock, and he hits it twice. And so maybe he's just agitated. Last week was not a good week for him. This going into this week, he doesn't know it yet, but we find that actually the first part of the portion is his sister dies, that Miriam dies this week. We find out later in the Torah portion, Aaron dies. So both his siblings die in this week's Torah portion. He's not in a good spot. Maybe it was his ego. Maybe he was upset. Maybe he was the rage. He has a short fuse. We know this. But no one's really sure. Was it the anger? Was it the frustration? And so as we enter this Shabbat, I want us to think about all these little pieces. The pieces about the stats from AAA. The interesting context of a comedian making light of a situation, but some of us know exactly what he's talking about. Maybe not to the extent of wishing everyone's family would die on the road, but some frustration we might have about honking. And so I'll invite us to think of all these things and also think of Moses. And maybe he was angry. Maybe he was frustrated. Maybe it was his ego because he says, I'll give you water. But whatever context it is, I invite us to sort of think of how we would manage it. The last thing that I want to say is that we don't carry sticks and hit rocks for water, but we do drive and we do we do interact with other people. Well, sometimes we're angry and sometimes we're not. And I invite you to think that of this great phrase from one of my teachers named Rabbi Richard Levy, who he's just retired, but he was, when I was in rabbinic school, the director of the rabbinic school in Los Angeles for Hebrew Union College, for the seminary. And he would say to us, because we were in Los Angeles, he would say, as you go out on your way, and you get onto the 405, which is a very large freeway in Los Angeles, if you don't know. I call it the 405 parking lot, because you were often not moving at all on the 405. And he would say, I invite you, before you get frustrated, to look at the person in the car next to you and think of them not as a person, but as a soul. Think that there's a soul in the car next to you. You have a soul. Maybe the people in your car all of us have souls. Look around you, and maybe if you examine that the person next to you is a soul and not a person wrapped in this metal object with the windows that we want to honk at, it might reframe your context. So I will leave you with that sort of image of the great and fabulous Rabbi Richard Levy. And I will wish us all a Shabbat Shalom. And as we go into the Shabbat, anger is inevitable, we know from Chukat, but how we manage it, I think, is the elegance and the ability. That's the elegance and the ability we have is how we manage it. Shabbat Shalom.